Thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. And again, as John had mentioned, this is a presentation that I presented at Midwest this year. And I also, last year at Leman Conference, I also presented some material that fits into this. And so any of you that was in that presentation, while you're going to hear some of those similar key points, I also kind of took the challenge with this presentation to really kind of tell a story on a lot of this carcass yield work that we've been working on at Kansas State. So it's pretty evident from Arkin's presentation, and all of us know that distiller grains are an extremely important byproduct to us in the swine industry. They're certainly the most predominantly used byproduct in the swine industry. And here you can see why as we look at the last 14 years of the amount of distillers production in this country, you can see that why they've become a viable option from an economic standpoint to include in our finishing diets. Now, while those can certainly be a potential source of lower cost energy, amino acids, and in the case of distillers, maybe potentially increased level of available phosphorus, there are some key important things that you have to be cognizant of when you're using these in formulation. You can use them, but with the possible expense of reducing feed efficiency and potentially gain. And as Arkin did an extremely well job of presenting on fat quality. But the main focus area for my presentation is its reduction in carcass yield. And so carcass yield is calculated by taking hot carcass weight and dividing that by live weight of the pig. And this becomes extremely important because while our producers are paid on a hot carcass weight basis, we all market our barns on a live weight basis. And so it's really hard to gauge what that carcass is going to hang if you don't have your head clearly wrapped around what that yield's going to be. If we just take a brief moment to kind of take a step back and look at the byproducts and compare them to their originating grain sources, you can see here corn compared to its byproduct distillers. We have a higher crude protein content, but as Arkin also pointed out, the energy level of that is quite a bit less than its originating grain source. And the reason that we're focused on it is because if you look at the crude fiber and the NDF and ADF level, it's about 3 times as high. And because we are in Kansas and wheat is an important commodity in our state, we also look at wheat and compare it to mids. Now, we don't have as much of a difference in crude protein when we compare mids to wheat. But again, mids are lower in energy and much higher in fiber than the originating grain source. If we take a kind of a step back in time, and I actually wasn't even born when this paper was published, so it's quite a bit of a step back in time for me. But Henry Turlington, a part of his master's work at the University of Kentucky, completed a project investigating the effects of increasing high fiber byproducts in corn soybean meal-based diet. And it's really sad that this work isn't published because it's really good work and is some of the first data that really set out to look at carcass yield when comparing byproducts. And they looked at soybean hulls, oat hulls, and wheat bran, and what essentially they did was double the amount of NDF level in their diet. So essentially just doubling the amount of fiber in their diet. They fed pigs from approximately 30 to 90 kilograms, and this is the first research that I could come up with that collected and weighed the contents in the large intestine and cecum. And you'll understand in the upcoming slides of why that's extremely important. And they reported no trial by treatment interactions suggesting that the measurements that they collected didn't have a different response when comparing each one of these to each other. So that means that soybean hulls, oat hulls, and wheat bran did not affect their measurements any differently from one another. As we look here, as we increase the added NDF level, and if you'll pay attention to the blue bars, as we increase the amount of fiber in the diet, we increase the amount of gut fill. And subsequently what we do is we dramatically reduce the amount of carcass yield. And so when you double the amount of fiber in the diet, here you can see that we reduced carcass yield by nearly 2%. As we kind of dive down into what's causing that, as you'll see here, again, as we increase the NDF, we get a slight increase in the amount of contents that are in the cecum, but in terms of total volume in the GI tract, you can see here that they get a much larger increase in the amount of contents that are left in the colon. And that's really what we're talking about here today, is the undigested fiber fraction that's left in the GI tract that's negatively impacting carcass yield. So if we do a little cowboy meta-analysis here, and we look at the effects of increasing DDGs on carcass yield, and we take the average slopes from numerous studies that have been published, this average slope is about 0.038%. And so just to kind of make it easier to understand, for every 10% inclusion in DDGs, you can expect about a 0.4% reduction in carcass yield. If we put that on an NDF level, looking at from a fiber standpoint, and we take the average of those slopes, we can see that we have an average slope for these same studies of 0.168%. So essentially, doubling the amount of fiber in that diet can potentially reduce carcass yield by over 1.5%. If we add in a few studies that aren't just including DDGs, such as looking at soybean hulls and also wheat mids, you can see here, that average slope is not that much different when comparing a bunch of different types of ingredients that are high in fiber with those of DDGs. And so I wanted to make that a point that there's overwhelming evidence that suggests that when we feed those high fiber diets, we are indeed impacting carcass yield. So it's the residual digestive contents that are leading to this reduction in carcass yield. And as I mentioned before, this results in a lighter carcass than predicted by the final live weight, which is what all of our producers use to market their barns. This is certainly dependent upon the level of the byproduct ingredient, but in those previous slides, I show you studies that had varying levels of oil content in those DDGs. And so again, we're talking about the fiber fraction in these. So what I want to do is I want to talk about some strategies that will improve or that have shown to improve carcass yield in corn soy diets, but can they potentially help us in a high fiber diet? As we look at adding dietary fat, there's been certainly some studies that have suggested when we add added fat in a couple of different varieties that we can get an improvement in hot carcass weight. And so will these actually help overcome this reduction in yield when we feed a high fiber diet? And so we're going to look at 3 separate studies. And for sake of time today, I'm going to step through these fairly quickly. But if you have any questions because we run over time, please just catch me outside. As we look at Salyer and others' data from 2012, what they have here is they've either fed a corn soy diet or a diet with 20% mids, and they added 2.5 or 5% added choice white grease into each one of those diets. And we can tell from the statistics that there was not an interaction between choice white grease and mids. And so what that's telling us that the added fat did not have a different impact dependent upon the different diet. So adding fat into the high wheat mid diet didn't have a different impact from adding it in the corn soy diet. And you can see that there was, they did report a reduction in carcass yield for adding 20% mids into that diet. However, when they added fat back in, on a main effect, they did not get an improvement in carcass yield. Now, a more recent study completed by Davis and others, where they fed a corn soy diet or a diet with 30% DDGs, with or without 5% added tallow. And it's important to note that this study, they fed these diets starting at 30 kilograms and fed them all the way to 130. So the entire finishing period. Now, as we look at these yields, they are slightly higher than what we would normally expect, but they don't depict in the paper a whole lot of information about how these were collected. But you can see here that they did get a response to adding the added fat to improving yield. But however, there was no interaction suggesting that the added fat improved carcass yield slightly in both of those studies. So I took that as, well, really what we want to look at from an economical standpoint, sometimes adding fat for the entire finishing period doesn't always pay out. But if we can potentially feed it for just a short period of time at the end of finishing, can we still see that improved hot carcass yield when feeding added fat for the last 20 days? And so in this project, it was 20 days long, feeding 30% DDGs and 5% added fat just prior to slaughter. And up to that point, all pigs were fed a diet containing 30% DDGs until that last 20-day period. For that last 20-day period, with or without DDGs, and then again the two levels of added fat, and we completed this both in the university and in the commercial setting. And so as we keep moving along here, you can see that there was not a DDG by fat interaction, suggesting that in our study, this is different from Davis and others, where they reported an improvement in yield with added fat. We did not see an improvement in yield with adding fat, but again, we do see the reduced carcass yield for feeding DDGs compared to that of a corn-soy diet. I'm going to sound like a broken record here towards the end. And the last thing that I want to talk about as we move on kind of in this area is adding ractopamine. Dr. Apple and others in 2007, where they reviewed past literature looking at all the different effects of feeding ractopamine, suggested that carcass yield would improve by nearly 1% when feeding pigs up to 20 milligrams per kilogram of ractopamine. And so in terms of today's legal levels of ractopamine, we could expect about 0.5% improvement in yield when we feed 10 milligrams per kilogram of ractopamine. Graham and others in 2014 looked at this, where they fed two diet types with or without ractopamine, and they fed these in a corn-soy diet or a high-fiber diet with 30% DDGs and 19% mids. As we can see here, for the first 49 days, the pigs were fed either the corn-soy or high-fiber diet, and then the last 24 days, they either continued on the corn-soy, high-fiber switched to the corn-soy, or they were fed the high-fiber diet throughout. There was no fiber by ractopamine effect or interaction, suggesting that it didn't matter what diet type that Paline was fed in, it provided the same response. But you can see here that while Paline or ractopamine was purely an additive effect, as we increase the level of fiber or the length of fiber, we still get the reduction in the reduction in carcass yield. Even with feeding ractopamine in the diet, we still see that. It's purely additive. Then as we move on, we look at the feed form, and there's no data to suggest that different feed forms, as John talked at the beginning of this session, of pelleting versus meal, but there are some studies that report it as a secondary measurement for the main objective of those projects. And so we wanted to look at that, and Nemechek and others in 2013 looked at the effects of diet form, meal versus pellet, in different diet types, so a corn-soy versus a high-fiber diet. And here, similar to Graham and others in 2014, for the first 64 days, they were either fed a corn-soy or a high-fiber diet, and then before slaughter, they were either switched to the corn-soy or they stayed on the high-fiber diet. And we can see here that, again, increasing the level or the amount of fiber that those pigs were fed, again, reduced carcass yield, but pelleting did not have a positive benefit on improving carcass yield. And again, there was no data to suggest that, but I just merely wanted to put that in the slide set to help answer some potential questions if there were any. So, lastly, I've shown you some strategies that haven't been as successful. So lastly, which strategies will improve carcass yield? Asmus and others in 2014 evaluated withdrawal strategies by switching pigs that were fed a 30% DDG and 19% wheat middling diet, switching those to a corn-soy diet approximately 3 weeks prior to slaughter, and specifically looked at their effects on carcass yield. So to do so, they fed a low-fiber corn-soy diet, a medium fiber, we'll call that, with a moderate level of distillers and wheat mids, and then a high-fiber diet that contained twice as much DDGs and mids as compared to the medium. And again, similar to Turlington and others in 1984, they measured the intestinal weights from each of the withdrawal strategies. So I understand that this is a busy slide, and so I'll hopefully explain it to you well enough that it'll make sense. They fed, for the first 43 days, they fed a low corn-soy diet or a high fiber. And then during the middle of the finishing period, they switched a group of them to a medium fiber diet or the corn-soy. And then also, they switched a high fiber group to a corn-soy in the late period or a medium, and then also feeding the high fiber diet throughout. So really what this is looking at is, can I take pigs that are fed a high fiber diet and switch them to a moderate level, or should I switch them to a corn soy? And that's the main thing that we're looking at. And you can see here that as we increase the length of period that we're feeding that high fiber diet, we do reduce carcass yield quite substantially. But the reason for my research is specifically this treatment right here. You can see that pigs that were fed the high fiber diet for the majority of the finishing period and then switched the last 23 days prior to slaughter to a corn soy diet had similar carcass yield to those that were fed a corn soy diet completely throughout. So the strategy with that is feeding the high fiber diet for as much of the finishing period as possible to improve the economic situation from a feed standpoint, but not negatively impacting your hot carcass weight. So kind of getting the best of both worlds. And as mentioned, they looked at the full large intestinal weight, and there's clearly an inverse relationship. As you remember, carcass yield performed in this fashion, but as we reduce carcass yield, you can see that there was an increase in full large intestinal weight as we increased the length of time that those high fiber diets were fed. And again, you'll see that pigs that were fed a high fiber diet all the way until 23 days prior to slaughter and switched to a corn soy diet had a full large intestinal weight very similar to those that were fed a corn soy diet throughout. So lastly, everyone else did a bunch of work. What did I do during my PhD? So I'll finally tell you a little more about that. So looking at Asmus and others in 2014, we wanted to determine the optimal timing for removing high fiber ingredients from the diet, switching them to a corn soy diet that encompassed improving not only carcass yield but also growth performance and other carcass characteristics. And we also wanted to validate this response from the university setting in a commercial farm as well. To complete this, we fed at the university 288 pigs with an initial body weight of around 35 kilos in an 88-day study. And these pigs were allotted to one of 6 dietary treatments. We fed either a corn soy diet with a low level of fiber all the way throughout, a high fiber diet with, again, 30% DDGs and 19% wheat middlings for the entire period. And then we fed the high fiber diet until 20, 15, 10, or 5 days prior to slaughter, at which we switched them back to the corn soy control. And you all met John at the beginning of the session. This is John helping strip the intestines. And if any of you have not had the pristine opportunity to do that, cancel your vacation plans, and K-State can help you do some of this work. But I show this because this is the consistency of a high fiber diet in the gut. It's very dense and very thick. And so when stripping those guts, I thought that it was really important to share with you all kind of the consistency of that undigested fiber fraction that's left in the large intestine. So as getting into the results, as we look at average daily gain, you can see here that there was no difference in average daily gain for any of the dietary treatments. And for the rest of the slides, I'll have the corn soy diet that was fed all the way throughout, the high fiber diet that was fed all the way throughout, or removing that high fiber diet 5, 10, 15, or 20 days prior to slaughter. Now, although there was no difference in average daily gain, as we look at feed efficiency, pigs fed the corn soy diet had the highest feed efficiency, and as we feed the byproduct of the high fiber diet, we do negatively impact feed efficiency. However, withdrawing those did not have an impact on feed efficiency. So there's not a lot that we can gain from a feed efficiency standpoint from removing the high fiber diet and switching that to the corn soy. And as mentioned, there was no difference in average daily gain, so it's not surprising that here we don't see any difference in final body weight across treatments throughout the study. However, the most important part of my talk today is that when we fed pigs the high fiber diet compared to the corn soy, we had a 1.5% reduction in carcass yield. And as we increase this withdrawal period up to 15 or 20 days prior to slaughter, we have carcass yield that is very similar to those of a corn soy control. As we look for the reason for that, we see about a 3 kilogram reduction in hot carcass weight for pigs fed the byproduct diet compared to the corn soy, and we increase and improve hot carcass weight at about 15 days, removing that high fiber diet and switching to the corn soy. As we look again for the reason, you can see that the full large intestinal weight was about a little over 1.2 kilograms heavier for pigs fed the byproduct diet with no withdrawal, comparing those to the corn soy. And in linear fashion, as we increase the number of days of withdrawal, we reduce the full large intestinal weight of those pigs. We can further conclude that it's merely just the undigested fractions remaining in the GI tract, because as we rinse the large intestinal weight, we see no difference in the rinsed weight between any of the dietary treatments. And so this is merely looking at weight. I don't have any information for you on volume, but from a weight standpoint, there is no difference. So lastly, and I promise I'll finish up, this is a commercial study where we took this same exact trial and put it out into our commercial system that we coordinate with New Horizon Farms in Pipestone, Minnesota. I just want to point out that the only difference from this study compared to the university is that instead of the 25-day withdrawal strategy, these were actually 24, 19, 14, and 9 days withdrawal, because inclement weather led to shutting the packing plant down for 4 days. And so we weren't able to just fit the exact treatment removal withdrawals for this study as the university. As we look here, final body weight was impacted in the commercial setting, where we had pigs that were fed the high fiber diet were much lower in final body weight compared to the corn soy. And it's important to point out that these diets were not balanced on energy. And so this diet's higher in fiber and lower in energy. It's not surprising that we see the difference in final body weight. However, we see, although it's not statistical, numerically, we see the similar responses in the university. As we feed the high fiber diet compared to the corn soy, we get a reduction in carcass yield by about 1%. And as we increase this withdrawal period up to about 19 days, here we see that improvement in carcass yield for removing that high fiber diet and switching to the corn soy. And we can again see here why. It's because we get an improvement in hot carcass weight by nearly 2 kilograms for merely withdrawing that high fiber diet for 19 days. So as we look at 2 slides on the economics, this was in spring of 2013 when this project was completed. You can see at this point in time, with these prices for corn and carcass weights, there was about a 50-cent advantage for feeding the high fiber diet throughout compared to the corn soy, but the producer was $2.30 ahead for implementing this withdrawal strategy. If you're wondering what to do when you go home, a similar situation, feeding a corn soy diet from an income over feed cost standpoint benefits you about 40 cents or so compared to feeding a high fiber diet throughout. But again, you're nearly $2 ahead on an income over feed cost basis when you implement a byproduct withdrawal strategy, switching those to a corn soy. So in conclusion, there's overwhelming evidence to support that high fiber diets reduce carcass yield and hot carcass weight. It's the undigestible fiber fraction remaining in the GI tract that's causing this negative impact. And pigs that are fed the high fiber diet had 1.2 kilogram more digestive contents remaining in the large intestine than that compared to the corn soy. And just as simple as few as 5-day withdrawal actually improved that carcass yield by getting rid of some of that leftover content in the GI tract. So a 15 to 20 day withdrawal strategy certainly implemented this, and other strategies such as fat and ractopamine have not been successful at fully restoring this lost yield from feeding these high fiber ingredients. But again, it's always important to plug in your economics and calculate this for your own producers, determine what is proper for you.